John Stauffer will not be joining us today because he hasn't been feeling well. So I will have to do this alone. And I hope that all of you will speak up and to some extent make up for his absence, speak on his behalf. As you may remember, our plan was to continue our discussion of last week rather than to turn immediately to democracy. We leave the subject of democracy and its deepening to next week. And today we continue the discussion of the economic order and its reconstruction. And I intend to do this in 4 steps, stopping all along the way and inviting your engagement. So the first step is to return to the theme of the present circumstance, the vacuum, which has been produced by what one might regard as the abdication of the American progressives, to understand its different aspects, its sources, and its consequences. The second theme is to turn, in the briefest outline, to the momentous question, well, what then is the alternative? And of course, I can't hope to do this in any detail here, but I will attempt to provide and to defend the sketch of an alternative. The third step is to discuss the social basis, the constituency that might be led to support such an alternative against the background of ideas about the relation between programmatic alternatives and social alliances. And then the fourth step is a kind of coda to my discussion today. I want to state some ideas about the relation between such an alternative and the themes discussed and equality. Because after all, the progressives think of themselves as egalitarians, and I want to probe their understanding of the practical implications of their egalitarianism with respect to structural change or its absence, and with respect to the budget on both its revenue-raising side and its spending side. So first, the vacuum. The claim made last week is that the progressives and their principal political vehicle, the Democratic Party, failed to come up with a plausible and powerful sequel to Franklin Roosevelt's project. According to the discussion that we had about the New Deal, this sequel could not be a simple repetition or continuation of the New Deal. The New Deal emphasized stabilization or restabilization of the economy and antidotes to economic insecurity for the individual worker and citizen. An alternative now would have to have among its central themes the organization of socially inclusive economic growth based on innovation and economic empowerment, the democratization of the market order, rather than simply its stabilization accompanied by safeguards against economic insecurity for the individual. So to work, to be responsive to the problems of today, this sequel would have to be a reinvention. It could not be a simple continuation of the New Deal. And we have to place this issue then in a larger world historical context, because after all, the American New Deal is the American version of the last major institutional and ideological settlement among the advanced societies of the North Atlantic world. And this is a settlement that has come to be called social democracy or social liberalism. In truth, it is an institutionally conservative social democracy. And that institutionally conservative social democracy on both sides of the Atlantic has become the default position of the progressives in much of the world. So the idea is that the market order, based on the established or inherited institutional arrangements, will continue to be what it is. We will expect it to be the engine of growth, the source of wealth, but then after the fact we will humanize it, especially through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. That is to say, by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. Historical social democracy in Europe had many other features. Among these other features were, first, a series of privileges accorded to insiders to the detriment of outsiders, especially the minority of the labor force that was stably employed in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and most especially in conventional industry, so-called Fordist mass production. That was the core historical basis of the social democratic parties. And these workers, these stable and relatively privileged workers, sometimes called in the Marxist categories a labor aristocracy, were benefited to the detriment of the significant number of workers who always remained relative outsiders, unstably employed in the so-called secondary part of the labor market. The second set of arrangements with which historical social democracy was associated were arrangements that resulted in the brokering of deals by government, by national governments, among big business and organized labor to settle on one particular path of growth, and that would distribute the benefits in a particular way. So any growth path, any macroeconomic policy generates certain benefits and detriments for particular social groups, for particular social classes. And to avoid inconclusive distributive conflict, the idea was that the organized parts of both business and labor would strike a deal. They would agree on a particular macroeconomic path, supposedly to the benefit of national growth as a whole. And these were called incomes policies or social compacts or social contracts. Now, what has happened in the subsequent evolution of social democracy, especially on its European home ground, is that it has increasingly abandoned these two sets of arrangements that I've just described. The privileges accorded to relative insiders, especially in the labor market, and the social contracts or incomes policies, these deals between big business and organized labor, orchestrated by the national government. And it's abandoned them for two sets of reasons, it seems. First, because they've been attacked persuasively as being both economically costly forms of rigidity imposed on the economy, and because they were seen as unfair, as unjust. But the second set of reasons, perhaps more powerful, is the consequence of a momentous change in the most advanced part of production. Conventional industry all over the world has declined. It is no longer the vanguard of production. A new vanguard has emerged, which we call the knowledge economy or the innovation economy or the experimentalist economy or the new economy. It has emerged, however, although in every sector, present in every sector, only as a set of socially exclusive fringes which lock out the vast preponderance of both workers and firms. And I have argued and will argue again that this insular character of the new vanguard has momentous consequences for both economic stagnation and economic inequality. So, social democracy on its European ground, in its canonical European form, which has been the most admired model of economic life in the world, has given up those two sets of arrangements. And it has retreated to its last line of defense. The last line of defense is the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or some equivalent to it. So this form of social democracy that has been liberalized or rendered flexible through the abandonment of those arrangements that I described a moment ago is sometimes labeled social liberalism. It is the reduced and liberalized form of social democracy. And what now has become the hegemonic program of the elites in both Europe and in the United States is an attempt to reconcile European-style social protection with American-style economic flexibility within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements. Now, I say all of that just so you understand the larger context in which these American events take place. And so, what then has happened on the economic side in the United States? Subsequent to the New Deal, given the failure of the progressives in the United States to establish a sequel to the New Deal, economic growth has been based on mass consumption, made possible in large part by the democratization of credit. So it's been a kind of fake credit democracy, as I described it last week, in substitution for the ideal of a property-owning democracy. And this fake credit democracy, this mass consumption made possible by the democratization of credit rather than by the democratization of property, has been enabled in turn by what has become the main strategy of economic growth in the United States, the cheap money policy. It is implemented not by the national government, which to a very large extent seems to have no strategy of growth whatsoever, but by the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And this policy of the democratization of credit reliant on the cheap money policy, has in turn been enabled in the recent historical period by the structural imbalances in the world economy. And the chief of those imbalances, as I argued last week, was the relation between the deficit and the surplus economies, and in particular between China and the United States. That was the single greatest engine of growth in the world economy, at least until the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008. The Chinese exported their trade and capital surpluses, and the reverse side of this export was the import of these surpluses by the deficit economies, and especially by the United States. And each of these countries used these structural imbalances in the world economy as a way of evading the imperative of structural change and evading the need to have a productivist project. So China, it's widely thought, needed to shift the main emphasis of growth from export-led growth to deepening of the internal market. It postponed that or avoided that through this operation of exporting its trade and capital surpluses. And the Americans would need to have a productivist project, I want to argue, but instead of developing a productivist project, they relied on leverage, on credit, on debt, enabled by the cheap money policy, and on the purchase of their debt, of their national debt by the Chinese, and on the Chinese commercial surpluses. So each country used these imbalances to escape what it needed to do. Now, I want to add now another element. Instead of developing a progressive, productivist project, a national productivism that would be socially inclusive and that would lift up the backward parts of the production system, the progressives in the United States devoted their attention to two sets of issues, which are often described as the wedge issues because they resulted in divisions in the country that inhibit the formation of a progressive majority, a majority that would support an inclusive progressivism. And those issues, which we will have occasion to discuss later in the course, were the race issue, the race and class issue, and the moral agenda, the struggle between moral agendas in the United States. So, with respect to the race issue, and anticipating now a later discussion, race was treated as a threshold issue separate from class. And as notably in the affirmative action policy. And I will want to argue later that this policy did indeed drive a wedge in any potential majority progressive coalition. So if you take affirmative action as the example, it is a policy that did mainly benefit the black professional and business class, to a much lesser extent the black working class, especially workers for government, such as the police, and least of all, of course, the mass of underclass blacks abandoned to the secondary part of the labor market and to the American prison system. So it generated benefits in inverse proportion to the need for them. It separated the black elite from the rank and file And what is relevant to our discussion here, it offended or threatened the white working class majority of the country, which felt itself the victim of a kind of conspiracy between the sanctimonious white elites and the virtual leaders of the blacks who were among the benefited by these policies. And with respect to the moral agenda, there's a struggle in the country between the religious or traditionalist moral agenda and the secular or modernist agenda. And the progressives sought to capture the federal judiciary and through federal law and the interpretation of the Constitution to impose their moral agenda on the rest of the country. Now, it happens that the majority of the white working class were in fact sympathetic to the religious or traditional agenda, and this then led to a reasonable reflection, which is, they say, these progressives, these so-called progressives, are doing nothing for us economically. Let's at least not let them attack our moral and religious ideas. In this circumstance, then, a central element of conservative statecraft in the United States became the ability of the conservatives to combine material concessions to the moneyed interests, the moneyed classes, and non-material or moral concessions to the moneyless classes. So the combination of those two so-called wedge issues helps explain a great deal of what has happened in the United States in this period. In this period, the Democratic presidents were to a very considerable extent implementers of the conservative program. So it didn't require a Democratic president to execute a Democratic project, a progressive project. The conservative project was executed by its putative political adversaries in this historical period. I realize, of course, that everything I'm saying is controversial, but I'm saying it, so I'm presenting my argument here intransigently, and I hope clearly. Now, all of this that I described had as one of its premises, going back to a much earlier moment in the argument of the course, the failure to reenact or to reinterpret that virtuous dialectic that we described in the life of the early republic, the first half of the 19th century, between independence and the Civil War. Remember, there was on top a national developmental project, the Hamiltonian Project. And then at the bottom up rather than top down, there was the selective democratization of what were then the two most important sectors of the American economy, agriculture and finance. And I argued, or we argued then, early in the course, that this combination of national developmentalism and selective democratization was in large part responsible for the ascent of the United States. And it's this combination which failed subsequently to be reenacted. When it recurred in American history, it recurred in ever weaker form. And there were two main inhibitions to the recurrence of this dialectic. One, the weakness of democracy, the subject that we'll come to next week, and the other, the weakness of thought. The failure to deepen, to generalize, to radicalize the idea that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. And that it's much more important to reinvent it, to redesign it in its legal and institutional architecture than it is to either regulate it or to attenuate for the inequalities that it generates through retrospective and compensatory redistribution. So that's a summary of the argument about the vacuum. And let me stop there and ask for your remarks. Yes.
What do you make of the Green New Deal as a possible productivist approach in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, so this is a very interesting topic. It could be a productivist approach. After all, one could say that the decarbonization of the economy, if it's not accompanied by institutional change in the institutions of the economy, would penalize very heavily the poorest in society, right? So it could be an occasion for a productivist project. It hasn't yet become one. And I think that the main temper of the environmentalism in the rich countries, including in the United States, up to now, has been to be a kind of post-ideological or post-structural politics. And its central theme is history has disappointed us. Look at the calamities of the 20th century. Let's take refuge in the great garden of nature. And so it's something that comes after, like a quality of life, middle class politics, rather than a politics with structural ambitions. But it doesn't have to be that. And so in other parts of the world, we think that an environmental policy must be a policy with structural intentions and implications. So in my country, in Brazil, for example, we have the issue of the Amazon and what sustainable development in the Amazon means. So sustainable development in a tropical rainforest has to be one of two things. Either it's a primitive extractivism, like the native populations taking rubber out of the trees or picking up nuts or something, in which case it has no scale, no technology, no scientific basis, and really no economic future. Or it is a variant of the knowledge economy, open to world science, highly productive, innovative. There's nothing in between. It's one or the other. So then one would think that the environmental concern, rather than being this post-structural thing that I just described, is a provocation to reinvent the structural debates in a new vocabulary. And I think the same thing would go for the United States. But whether it's been developed in that spirit is a totally different question. Would you like to continue?
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, do you think the federal jobs guarantee is a productive part of the Green New Deal, or do you think it's distracting?
Well, this is like a question that was asked about the minimum guaranteed income, right? So remember that one of the two main policies pursued by the New Deal in its early period of institutional experimentalism, the first year and a half, was the employment of the unemployed directly by the government through the Works Project Administration. So the idea was the government was the employer of last resort. And that then was combined with the other theme of the early New Deal, which was corporatism. Managed competition, the restabilization of the economy in cartels allowed or designed by the government to uh, organize the market rather than to radicalize competition or democratize access to productive resources and opportunities. So I don't think that the use of the government as an employer of last resort all by itself could be part of a productivist agenda. It's part of this idea of there being a haven, a safeguard, a fallback. But it depends on what it's combined with. Because if it were then combined with initiatives to redesign the evolution, to redirect the evolution of technology and lift up the economic rearguard, the backward firms, and the economic agents that have lost connection with business enterprise, then it's a different matter. Then it becomes productivist. So I don't think you can diagnose in isolation what its political meaning is. You have to know what it's a part of or what it's not a part of. Yes.
So I know with the New Deal, there was like labor unions during the Great Depression. The New Deal kind of played a role, and the future for labor unions at the time kind of looked grim.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about like how labor unions and right to work play into this. I've been thinking about it lately. There was a debate tournament recently hosted by Harvard with like little novice debaters in middle school debating on whether right to work legislation harms or benefits America, and I was kind of curious to like how right to work and unions play into like the New Deal and our.
Well, when I discuss the alternative now, I'm going to come to the question of labor and capital.
Okay.
But let me say, for the moment, let me say this. So, it is a fact now in the United States. The United States is, in this as in much else, at the extreme of a spectrum. All over the world, among the advanced societies, the level of unionization has fallen. In the United States, it's fallen dramatically. So, a very small percentage of the private labor force is now unionized. And unionization survives mainly in public employment and in the third sector, like universities. And everywhere else it doesn't exist. And so people say, well, let's reunionize. To some extent, it seems to me it's too late for that. That we're not going to have a 20th century solution for a 21st century problem. Unionization, collective bargaining was an idea of countervailing power. In the employment relation, there is stark disparity between the bargaining power of the employer and the employee. So the idea was to reestablish the reality of contract. I think there would need to be a different kind of legal framework of collective bargaining, like the one that was adapted in Latin America, and we have to invent a different framework. But I think that this issue is now less significant than the status of unstable, precarious labor, which is now the majority of the labor force. So people not only are not unionized, but they have no guarantees of stability in their employment. And it's this condition of precariousness, which is, so to speak, the emergency problem in labor. That's what has to be dealt with first. And I want to speak to that when I come to the issue of labor next. Yes.
I was just hoping, because I think we discussed like a lot of ideas that related to this idea of the vacuum, but I guess.
Can you speak louder,
Yeah,
please?
you've discussed a lot of ideas related to the concept of the vacuum, but I guess like in a nutshell, how would you like give a broad definition of the problem at hand posed by that?
The problem is, so there are different ways of defining the problem, but one way of defining the problem that's relevant to this particular moment in our discussion is the progressives have no approach to the supply side of the economy. They have an approach only to the demand side of the economy. Or to state the same idea in a different vocabulary, they have no productivist project. They only have a distributivist project. So I think this is a tremendous weakness in their position, because taking a step back, I would say that in national life, in politics, the force that most credibly embodies the cause of growth, energy, innovation, construction, commands the agenda. The other people then get to put a human face on this project. So that's then the characteristic situation of the retreating social democrats in the world, in the whole world. Who are they? They are the humanizers of the inevitable. So if you ask what is their project, a crude, simple answer is their project is the project of their conservative adversaries with a kind of humanizing discount. So instead of a savage form of this market order, let's have a more humane form. That's their project. That's a losing project to my mind. So a very simple idea of what I mean by a vacuum is the vacuum is that. It's that retreat in which the main thing, which is the form of the order, of the economic and political order, is given up. It's given up to the adversary, and the task then becomes to humanize what remains, to sugarcoat it, to attenuate its inequalities and so forth. That's what I mean by a vacuum. And now, the problem that has emerged in the world, it's maybe less clear in the United States than it is in many other parts of the world, is that this institutionally conservative social democracy, which has no proposal for the reorganization of either production or power, is unable to solve or even to address any of the major structural problems of the contemporary societies. That's the fundamental issue. And that's then another sense of what I mean by a vacuum. So, first of all, they can't address the nature and consequences of this hierarchical segmentation of the economy, of the production system. The division between vanguards and rearguards, between advanced and backward sectors, and the abandonment of the majority of the population, of the labor force, to what is in effect make work in the backward parts of the production system. They have no way of addressing that, and they don't address that. Then the second problem is social cohesion. So, under institutionally conservative social democracy, the basis of social cohesion, money transfers organized by the state, its policies of entire, against the background of a high level of social, cultural, religious homogeneity. To the extent that this homogeneity is eroded by migratory flows, for example, or by greater social and cultural pluralism, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes patent. So social cohesion has to have another basis. I think that its most important basis is the multiplication of forms of collective action, bringing people together to accomplish things that they all want. And then a third problem of an example of an issue that lies beyond the horizon of institutionally conservative social democracy is transformation in politics. So these democracies are all weak democracies. That's what we're going to discuss next week. And they require crisis to make change possible. So if there's no crisis, there's no change. That's their rule. And so there has to be a war, or there has to be a depression. Otherwise, nothing changes. And so we would need to have then a way of rendering the impulse to transformation endogenous and weakening the dependence of change on crisis. That's a third example. So without that, we're all sort of waiting for the comet, like Halley's Comet I mentioned, waiting for the comet to come, and it will allow us, it will create the opportunity, in which we can then enact transformation. So that's what's not acceptable, right? Because then our hands are tied unless there's some great trauma. And that's a reason to reorganize politics so that it doesn't depend on that. Yes.
So you mentioned the sort of humanization of the market order and this progressive idea of like sort of sugarcoating what's currently happening in our market order. Do you think that would still provide more of an advantage than the current market order, or do you think that would be worse because it would be shielding
I didn't quite get that. What do you mean it provide more of an event? What?
like this progressive ideal as of like this sugarcoating of the market order as you described? Sort of this like
There would be better than what?
than what currently exists, or do you think it would just
Well, of course, but you know, this is like one standard version of an American progressive, like some of the Democratic candidates to be president of the United States was, what do they want? And I say irreverently, what they want is for the United States to be more like the Sweden of 1970. So you say, well, isn't that better than the United States today? Well, in some ways it's better, in other ways it's worse. But it's not really a feasible ideal. The United States isn't going to become the Sweden of 1970. Their idea of the Sweden of 1970 is mythical anyway. Sweden was never like that. And they don't understand the Swedish experience. So I would resist agreeing with your proposition, which is that's better than nothing. It's not clear to me that it's better than nothing. It seems to me to be a stand-in, a surrogate for a program that they don't have. That's what I would want to argue. Yes.
I'm curious about the conservative project about giving money to the money class and giving the morals to the
Yes.
other. Do you think that if they hadn't succeeded in doing that, I'm concerned about the relative size and power of those groups. Do you think that if they hadn't succeeded at giving money to the money class and had instead given money to like the underclass, the working class, the secondary market, and had given morals to the money class, it would have had the same effect as like a comet, like you were describing, or like a war
No.
or depression?
I didn't quite understand that. So are you saying that this arrangement that they had to give money to the moneyed and moral sops to the moneyless, that this arrangement couldn't work, or what are you saying?
No, if they had reversed the two, if they had given money to the secondary market people and given morals to the money class, do you think that people would have been?
I don't understand why they would have done that. I mean, the money people only want money. They didn't understand the words of Christ, that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go into heaven. They haven't heard of that. So I don't see why they would be offered or interested in any offer other than material.
I guess the general premise of my question was to say, if the conservative project had failed, do you think that there would have been some sort of?
So I don't think that this conservative project, as I described it, was a permanently successful operation, right? Because it also didn't solve any of these problems. It didn't produce a productivist project. The cheap money policy ended up in the dirt in the crisis of 2008. And so then there was the vacuum continued, and then plutocratic populism comes into the vacuum, right? But plutocratic populism then also has no project. And I'm not just talking about the United States, in the whole world. The populist right wing, what is the project of the populist right wing? On the economic side, it is to buy a few more years for the Rust Belt. You know, the project of the right, including in the United States, Trump's policy when he was president was not so different from the policy of the left-wing Democrats. Let's impede offshoring, plant closings, subcontracting. There's no project of industrial conversion of the Rust Belt into something else, which they then combine with restraints on migration. And in which undoubtedly it was in the interest of the unskilled workers in the United States to restrain the entrance of more unskilled labor into the United States. That's obvious. That's not questionable. So it's all true. But what's remarkable in all of that is the poverty of positive alternatives, because these are all negative measures. These are all defensive measures, which suggest no future. Right? They have no future. They don't even gesture towards a future. And that remained the... So I think that this plutocratic populist moment in the United States and in other countries is like an interlude. It's not as if they had then a project which their conservative or progressive predecessors did not have. They also had no real project. In general, the populist right has no project other than the preservation of the inherited forms of production and the strengthening of executive authority. They don't even have a constitutional project, much less a project in political economy. So then I would say this is a huge opportunity, because it's not as if the right has then come into the vacuum and occupied it with a project. It hasn't occupied with a project. It's this state of indefinition and availability persists. That's what I would say. Yes.
To follow up on that, now that we know what the vacuum is, what would a progressive, forward-looking project that's actually designed for the 21st century look like? I know you mentioned in the previous class about the...
Well, I intend to speak to that next. So that's the next subject, because I always believe in alternatives. And it's hard to talk about alternatives. You know, it's like... And before going into that, I want to repeat here what I insist on saying about this discussion of alternatives, that there's this dilemma. I propose something close to what exists. You say, that's certainly feasible, but it's trivial. I propose something far away from what exists. You say, that's interesting, but it's utopian. So in the current climate of opinion in the world, almost everything that can be proposed is likely to be dismissed as either trivial or utopian, or both. Now, the first thing to say is that this idea arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument or of a transformation. It's not about blueprints, it's about successions. It's about a direction. So the most important attributes of a programmatic argument, an argument about alternatives, is that it mark a direction, and in a particular historical circumstance, it defined the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. That's what we want from a programmatic argument. Now, this problem is vastly exaggerated, aggravated, by a contingent feature of the history of ideas, which is our lack of any now credible or usable way of thinking and talking about structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives. So there was a theory which had overwhelming influence on the left, which was Marxism, which was a theory of structural change. At its heart was the idea that structures are made and imagined. They're not part of the furniture of the universe. We created them, therefore we can understand them from within, as we don't understand natural objects, like the atomic structure of a phenomenon in nature. But in Marxism, this idea was surrounded by a set of illusions. So first, that there's a closed list of these alternative regimes. Marx called them the modes of production. Second, that each of them is an indivisible system. So It's either replaced all at once or it's managed. So there's a binary idea of politics. It's either reformist or revolutionary. And the third is there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems in history. All of those ideas are completely false. They've been discredited by historical experience and historical learning, and very few people believe in them. But they continue to use the vocabulary of that theoretical tradition because it's the only one they know. So capitalism, class conflict, and so forth. Now, so there's this confusion. Now, the effect of the confusion is to result in a fake conception of political realism, which is that something is realistic if it's close to what already exists. So if it's far from what exists, it's not realistic. If it's close, it is realistic. That's really just a declaration of intellectual failure. That's not an account of transformation. And so that helps explain this false dilemma that I described. So that's just my way of background to say no one knows how to do it, but that's not a reason not to keep trying. And because we have to create this programmatic discourse from the ground up, from the inside out, through these fragmentary attempts. Now, there's a rhetorical problem, which is the following. Any transformation worth thinking about can be described at different points of proximity or remoteness to the present. And in general, here, in a setting like this one, in which we're not in politics, there's reason to emphasize a middle points of the distance, that is, neither very close to what exists nor very far away, because this middle point of the spectrum lends itself to conceptual clarification. But in practical politics and in the discourse of transformation, we in general don't like this middle point of the spectrum, because the initiatives described at this level are likely to seem too close to what exists to arouse enthusiasm, but not close enough to be feasible. And so that's why in the discourse of transformation and of political prophecy, we try to combine what is very close with what is very far away. So the discourse of political prophecy and transformative practice must be simultaneously practical and prophetic. Unlike a discourse like this one, in this setting, where the premium is on conceptual clarification. Now I say that just because I'm going to describe the alternatives or the productivist project mainly at this middle level, and I need you then to correct for this, understanding that you can describe it closer or further away. The direction is what matters. So the topic is, what then is the alternative? That's what everyone asks. With what sincerity, I don't know. You know, just like I reminded you of the other day of this remark of Goethe's. No matter what you do or write, people will say, "Where's the rest?" But we have to insist on this attempt anyway. So when I refer to a productivist project, I think there are three main focal points of such a productivist project in the advanced societies, including the United States today. So the first is the relation between vanguards and rearguards in the system of production, the relation between the forward and the backward parts of production. The second is the relation between labor and capital, and the third is the relation of finance to the real economy. And I would say in that order of importance, in the order which I just stated. So the most important issue is the relation of the new vanguard of production to the rest. So the most advanced form of production is no longer conventional industry for this mass production. Production of the large-scale production of goods and services, standardized goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor in very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. It's the new vanguard has become the knowledge economy, the experimentalist economy, the new economy, the innovation economy. And this new vanguard has emerged in every part of production, not just in advanced manufacture, but also in intellectually dense services, and even in scientific or precision agriculture. In fact, one of the characteristics of economic life in the age of the knowledge economy is that the distinction among sectors is to some extent effaced. So, for example, advanced manufacture consists in large part in intellectually crystallized economic services. And many of the businesses are fabless, they don't have a physical apparatus. And it's not an easy matter to define what the knowledge economy is, because a form of production reveals its nature and its potential only as it spreads. So the knowledge economy as we have it now is an insular knowledge economy. And it's quarantined, it's cabined in these fringes in different parts of the production system, which exclude the vast majority of the labor force. Because it's quarantined, it doesn't fully reveal its potential. And it appears in a series of perverted forms. So it now, the emergence of the insular knowledge economy all over the world is presenting the world with a dilemma. Here's the dilemma. Development economics, the theory of economic growth and development, used to have a prescription for rapid economic growth. The heart of that prescription was very simple. It was, there's a shortcut to economic growth. The shortcut is take workers and resources from the less productive parts of the economy and put them in the more productive parts. Meaning, in practice, take them from agriculture and put them in industry. That was the shortcut. And the idea was you can go a very long distance by this shortcut. Ultimately, you'll hit up against the limits of the so-called fundamentals, which are institutions and education. But before you hit against those limits, you can go a long distance through this shortcut. Now, what has happened is this. The shortcut no longer works. One country after another in the world is deindustrializing. And deindustrialization in the United States is just a variant of this worldwide phenomenon. So, conventional industry is no longer the vanguard. It is a vestige of an earlier vanguard. And it continues to flourish only where returns to labor and tax takes are very low, often in remote parts of the world. So what would be the alternative? The alternative would be a broad-based, socially inclusive form of the knowledge economy. But that alternative doesn't exist. Even in the most advanced economies with the most educated populations. So how can we expect it to exist in the rest of the world? That's the dilemma. I think this is a false dilemma because the two sides of the dilemma are not equal. The Rust Belt industries, conventional industry, is not coming back. It exists as a vestige, or if not as a vestige, as a sidekick as a satellite to the new advanced form of production. There's the people who control the knowledge economy discover a way to bifurcate the process of production. They retreat, instead of disseminating the knowledge economy remains more and more insular because they discover a way to commodify or routinize part of it. That part they delegate, they subcontract to workers and businesses in other parts of the world. And the creative and lucrative core of it they keep for themselves. That's what I mean by the bifurcation. So this dilemma can only be broken, if it can be broken, on the second side. That is, we don't have in the world the example of a socially inclusive form of the knowledge economy. We would have to create one by transforming this seemingly inaccessible task into an accessible one, dividing it up into parts and stages. That's how the dilemma would have to be broken. So the insularity of the knowledge economy has momentous consequences. It destroys the basis of social democracy, the core constituency, which is a stable labor force assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of large economic entities, corporations. And it is the fundamental source of economic slowdown in economic growth and in the growth of productivity. If we deny the most advanced practice to most of the workers and most of the firms, which is the characteristic of the insular knowledge, how can we not expect there to be slowdown? And the second momentous consequence has to do with economic inequality. So the inequality is anchored in this abyss that becomes deeper and deeper between the advanced and backward parts of production. Compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer is completely inadequate to annul these contradictions. It would have to be massive in order to deal with the consequences of inequality. And long before it reached the requisite dimension, it would begin to derange the established economic institutions and incentives, exacting an unacceptable cost in lost output. So the question is how we can develop an inclusive knowledge economy. And I think it depends on a series of requirements. So it depends on a radically different kind of education. We've begun to speak about that. It depends on the accumulation of social capital, because the knowledge economy requires a heightening of the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust, allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. And it requires, most of all, innovation in the legal and institutional arrangements of the market order. And that's what I want to focus on now for the moment. So imagine a series of stages of this, in which you begin modestly and you go forward. So the most proximate is you use the powers of government to broaden the access to productive resources and opportunities in favor of two main sets of economic agents. First of all, the small and medium-sized backward firms, which are responsible, in fact, for most jobs in the economy and even most of the output, but are archaic or backward. And second, the individual economic agents who have no stable connections with any business enterprise, which is an increasing part of the labor force. And so you would have to have a 21st century counterpart to the 19th century agricultural extension. That is, you go to the backward firms and the backward agents, and you lift them up, you equip them, you empower them. That's what I mean by the industrial counterpart to the agricultural extension. You repackage, reinvent the technologies that are crucial so they become assimilable by these backward economic agents. And you discover experimentally what works and you disseminate it. So this has to be some kind of partnership of the state with the economic periphery in the production system. So let's say that's the first stage. Then the second stage is out of this activity, this experimental activity, you begin to develop a form of strategic coordination or partnership between the government and the firms or the economic agents that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. So it's different from the two main forms of government-business relations that are now on offer in the world. One is the American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and the other is the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. You need to have a third model of a form of partnership or strategic coordination that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. And on the horizontal, that's the vertical axis, the relation between governments and firms. On the horizontal axis, in the relation among economic agents or among firms, cooperative competition. That is, like the farmers did in the early 19th century. You they're independent proprietors and entrepreneurs, but they pool resources to achieve economies of scale. And then far in the future, remotely then, continuing this idea of the innovation in the nature of the market order, you then can imagine a radical innovation in the regime of property. So you say, the market order will not be nailed to the cross of a single dogmatic version of itself. Different regimes of property and contract will coexist experimentally in the same market order. And one of those regimes can still be the traditional unified property right, which, as I said in an earlier class, has the advantage of allowing someone, the entrepreneur, to do something that no one else believes in. But there will be another regime of a kind of rotating capital auction. You'll vest the productive resources of society in these independent trusts, and they will auction off capital to their most efficient users. Whoever is able to assure the trust of the highest rate of return will get to use those productive assets, liquid capital or technological apparatus, while they can continue to assure the highest rate of return. That's the speculative idea, just as a thought experiment, but marking a direction. So the idea is, we'll radicalize the notion of the market. The freedom in the market will not just be freedom to recombine factors of production within a framework of production and exchange that is unchallenged. It will also be freedom to innovate in the framework of production and exchange through devices such as these that I've described. So that seems to me to be the most important element in the creation of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. Education and social capital are necessary, but not enough. There has to be a renovation in the institutional vocabulary of the market order. That's the least acceptable part to the asset holders, to the elites, of course. So that's the number one issue, the first focal point in a productivist project. The second focal point has to do with the relation between labor and capital. So the fundamental question is the question that was taken as central in the 19th century. When is free labor really free? An inclusive knowledge economy must be based on free labor. But what is free labor? There are three main forms of free labor. There is wage labor, labor bought and sold, which the 19th century liberals and socialists regarded as a deficient and transitory form of free labor, retaining some of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. Then there is self-employment and cooperation. Those are the two higher forms of free labor. So the problem which the 19th century liberal and socialist friends of self-employment and cooperation were unable to solve was how the predominance of self-employment and cooperation could be reconciled with the imperatives of economies of scale. Now, in the present reality of labor, there's an emergency problem. So the emergency problem is the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to precarious employment, unstable employment. And the emergency problem requires an emergency solution. So the emergency solution has to be the creation, alongside the established labor law, collective bargaining law, of a second body of rules to deal with this new economic reality. So there are two discourses in the world now about labor. There is the syndicalist discourse based on the primacy of unionization, collective bargaining, and so forth, which wants to outlaw all of these forms of temporary labor or precarious labor as illegal, illegitimate. And I think we can't. We can't decree the illegality of these new relations of production. This is a change that is rooted in the different ways of producing things. And then there's the neoliberal discourse, which under the slogan of flexibility, in fact wants to condemn the majority, the largest part of the labor force to radical economic insecurity, which then results in the cheapening of the returns to labor, the cheapening of the wage. So I think what is necessary is to distinguish the legitimate and unavoidable flexibility from the illegitimate insecurity and cheapening of labor. So you can imagine a kind of sliding scale in which you say, to the extent that we use the information and communication technologies to organize and represent this precarious labor, there doesn't have to be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. But to the extent that we don't organize and represent them, there has to be a direct legal intervention. And an example of such an intervention is the principle of price neutrality. We say, labor rendered under conditions of unstable employment has to be remunerated at a level comparable to the similar labor performed under conditions of stable employment. So we intervene in the employment relation with a particular legal strategy. So let's say that's what I would say in the first phase has to have primacy. The attempt to master in law this new reality of production and not allow it to run on its own toward a radical economic insecurity. So the question of unionization that you asked about, and I said it was too late for that. I think the alternative would be a different kind of collective bargaining. So there are two main regimes in the 20th century. There's the contractualist regime of collective bargaining, and there was the corporatist regime, inspired initially by the Carta del Lavoro of the Italians of Italy, and imitated in Latin America by left-leaning nationalist regimes. So corporatist regime is based on, the contractualist regime is based on two principles. One principle is unionism is voluntary. It's like contract. The workers choose to unionize or not. And the second is the unions are part of the state. So they're It's a form of controlled popular mobilization under the tutelage, typically, of a Ministry of Labor, which is part of the national government. The corporatist system is based on two opposite principles. Everyone is automatically unionized according to their position in the production system. Unionization is not a choice, it's automatic. It's a gift, not of the state, but of the law. And the second principle is that the unions, the unions are part of the state. That's the second principle of corporatism, as I said, under the tutelage of a Ministry of Labor. Now, what would be desirable? What would be desirable would be a hybrid regime which would recombine these two principles. So we would take from the contractualist regime the principle that unionization, from the corporatist regime, the principle that unionization is automatic. Everyone is automatically unionized. Once they have a job in a particular sector, unionization is the automatic result. But we then take from the contractualist regime the principle that the unions are completely independent of the state. And therefore, different movements within the union system, affiliated or not to political parties, compete for position in this unitary structure, just as political parties compete for position in the system of the state. That would be the alternative. Now, it seems to me that it's too late for that alternative, but that's what I would recommend for the organized part of the labor force. And then for the unorganized part of the labor force, this regime of this special legal system, this new set of labor laws, alongside the inherited labor law, the collective bargaining law. So let's say that's the first stage. Then the second stage is the application of the power of the state to influence the evolution of technology, so that technology doesn't simply replace labor, which to some extent it will always do, but also enhances labor. And that has special significance when we come to the individual economic agent that has lost stable connection to business enterprises. I gave the example of a machine repair person or a nurse practitioner. And we transform these individual economic agents into technologically equipped artisans. So let's say that's the second stage. And the third stage then converges with this idea of the vesting of the productive assets, not in the state, not in the government, but in these independent trusts representing the social interests, experimentally and independently managed and so forth. So that's the second theme. The third theme of a productivist project is the relation of finance to the real economy, finance and production. So under orthodox finance theory, a perfectly competitive capital market allocates resources to their most efficient users. If it fails to do that, it's because there's some competitive flaw in perfect competition, including in symmetry of information. There's an asymmetry of information. Or there's a flaw in the localized regulatory response to the localized competitive flaw. That's the orthodox theory. What the orthodox theory doesn't allow is that different ways of organizing the relation between finance and the real economy can either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to production. So, and when the Americans under Andrew Jackson dissolved the National Bank and organized this decentralized system of credit, they were tightening the relation of finance to production. They weren't just having a different regulatory framework. They were reinventing the institutional arrangements that govern the relation of finance to production. So what prevails then in these financialized economies, like the American economy today, is financial hypertrophy rather than financial deepening. So the finance system becomes bloated, it absorbs profit and talent, but it renders less and less service to the real economy. And then the three enigmas that I began to draw your attention to in an earlier class. The first enigma is, what is the point of all of that liquid capital in the banks and the stock markets? It's supposedly to serve the productive agenda of society. But in fact, the vast preponderance of financial activity has no relation to the expansion of output or the ascent of productivity. Initial public offerings in the stock market have a direct relation, but they're episodic. Or you could say, establishing a benchmark of value in the stock market allows the companies to borrow money. So that's an oblique relation. But in fact, what happens is that the levels of financial engineering use the real transactions of the economy as a pretext, but they have less and less relation to what goes on in the real economy, in the production system. The overwhelming preponderance of productive activity is internally financed in the production system itself on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And that then leads to this disquieting question. What then is the point of all of that capital if it's not to serve production? So the second enigma is the asymmetrical relation of finance to the real economy in good times and bad times. In good times, it's indifferent to the real economy. In bad times, it's destructive. And the third enigma is that the responsibility, which in principle would be the most important responsibility of finance, which is to fund the creation of new assets in new ways, which is the special mission of venture capital and the associated forms of finance, is in fact a minuscule part of the activity of the capital markets, when it should be a central part. So the question is how we deal with these enigmas. We have to deal with them by deepening the relation of finance to the real economy, to the detriment of what I call financial hypertrophy, the bloating without function. And so you can imagine at the initial step a series of ways of discouraging or prohibiting forms of financial engineering that have no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the ascent of productivity. Let me give you the example of options contracts, puts and calls, and so forth. So their historical origin was in the commodity markets, where they have an undoubted benefit in increasing liquidity. But it's much less clear that they perform such a function in equity markets. So you would have to reshape this, where they were supposedly an antidote to gambling, but have been converted into a device of gambling. So you have to prohibit these activities. And I insist on this point. The issue is not financial speculation. The problem is not the speculative element in finance. Financial speculation is useful in developing information and in allocating risk. The problem lies in the dissociation of the speculative element of finance from the real agenda of production. That's where the problem is. And so you would then have to have a positive part of this agenda, which is multiplying the channels between the dormant saving of society, for example, in the public and private pension systems of the world, and productive investment, especially in the creation of new assets in new ways. So part of that dormant saving has to be put in diversified portfolios for investment in this future. So that's the first step. And then the final step converges with the final step of the other parts of the productivist project in the reinvention of the market order and the property regime, as in my thought experiment about the trusts, the public trusts, which hold the productive assets of society. So this gives you the broadest sense of what I mean by a productivist agenda, productivist alternative. It's focused on the reorganization of the market order cumulatively for the sake of narrowing the distance between the productive vanguards and the productive rearguards, making free labor really free in the age in which most employment relations are unstable, and enlisting finance in the service of production, under the principle that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. So that's a simple account of what I mean by a productivist alternative. Your comments, questions? So let me go on immediately to the next question, and then we can discuss this together. So this is then the third part of the trajectory that I had in mind. What is the constituency for this, for such a productivist agenda in a contemporary society like the United States? So I think there are three groups or three classes that are most immediately relevant. First, among the asset holders, among the elites, there has to be some division between the producers and the rentiers, the productivists and the rentiers. And a faction of the elites has to embrace a productivist project, value creation rather than rent seeking, and do so in its own interest and in the interest of national empowerment and national prosperity. That's what has happened in all of modern history. That's, for example, it's the story of the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the middle of the 19th century. A faction of the elite comes to power with a productivist idea, and the idea, this is how we can become prosperous and powerful, and it's always associated with an appeal of that faction of the elite, beyond the elite, to some part of the mass, and associated with the idea of national empowerment. So that's the first element. The second element is the workers, the traditional working class, headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, which was the historical basis, the core constituency of historical social democracy. It and its leaders have to come to the conclusion that this purely negative and defensive strategy of buying a few more years for conventional industry for the Rust Belt has no future. And it has to be replaced by a project of industrial conversion. The conversion of the conventional industry into a version of the knowledge economy. And then many of the groups that the workers used to think of as their rivals or enemies, the small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, have to become their allies in that project. And the third group is the one that I have the greatest trouble in defining, but it is perhaps the most important group. And now let me for a moment not speak about the United States, but about the world generally. So in most countries in the world now, the industrial working class is a small minority that no longer sees itself or is seen by the rest of society as the bearer of the general interests of society. It's seen as just one more special interest group. And most people are poor in the world, all over the world, but they have embraced the consciousness, the mental horizon of the small business class, the petty bourgeoisie. So their default object of ambition is to have a small business, a small store, a small shop, to rise to modest prosperity and independence, which in the absence of some other vehicle by which this aspiration could be satisfied, then takes the form of traditional, archaic, isolated, retrograde family business. So this is a group which I would call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not part of the small business class or the petty bourgeoisie objectively, but subjectively they are a part. They have assimilated this consciousness of rise to modest prosperity and independence as their horizon. And in the absence of a different tangible expression of this ambition, the ambition devolves to this idea of isolated retrograde family business. So what is crucial then is to win over this subjective petty bourgeoisie to a broader idea of the ways in which its aspirations could be achieved. Now, I wonder whether there's a counterpart in the United States to this idea of the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So in American history, the small business class has always punched above its weight. There's always been an association in the national consciousness of this idea of a small-scale entrepreneur, a farmer, a small business, as the embodiment of the national spirit. And it's been identified in the absence of alternative vehicles with isolated, regressive family business based on self-exploitation and family serving. Now, is it possible, I ask, to see a counterpart to this phenomenon in the United States? There's a large part of the American labor force which still thinks of itself and its future in these terms. Because it seems to me that in this coalition that I've described, of these possible constituencies, the most important elements are the first and the third. That's not the workers in the traditional sense. They're less important than the productivist part of the elite and what I'm calling the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Those are the most important elements in the coalition that could support a productivist project of this kind, an inclusive vanguardism. So what do you think? What is the basis in the United States for the promotion of such a socially inclusive productivism? From what classes, from what groups in the society does it come? Can it come? So this is all an argument which is it's sort of strange because in the United States, for a long time, the progressives has appeared as having only this distributivist agenda. And so it's hard to think of them because it seems like this discourse would be more natural for the Chamber of Commerce than for a progressive movement because it is producerist, it is productivist. And I'm insisting on this idea of a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. And the question is, what is its constituency in the United States today? Yes?
I think for the production economy, in order to keep up with it, we've had to manufacture this artificial need for more consumerism. consumption.
Because the basis has been mass consumption of
Yeah.
economic growth, yes.
In order to expand that with jobs instead of just the intellectual economy, because we don't have that alone, we've manufactured. I think of like influencers and influencer culture in that, where their entire job is they're not working for a company, but they're supposed to sell you an idea and sell you something and sell you trends, so that way you buy in. And we see more and more influencers rising into that, and we have less
But
production.
seeing it from the side of consumption, right?
Yes.
Because the moral aspect of a producerist agenda is that it appeals to people as agents and not simply as consumers or beneficiaries. And of course, one would think that this runs deep in the American sensibility, this idea of the individual as being an agent and not simply as being an agent who can be empowered and not simply a beneficiary who can be co-opted. So the producerist vocabulary appeared at certain moments in American history. For example, Henry Ford had used the term producerism. I prefer productivism. Huh? But it's the same idea that the debate should be organized around the agenda of production and not around the agenda of consumption. And Henry Ford famously said, I like to pay my workers well so that they can buy my cars. And of course, this is a kind of joke because they could buy someone else's cars or they could buy no cars at all. And what that joke reveals is that there is no private contractual solution to this problem. Permanent breakthroughs on both the supply and demand sides of the economy. There's only an institutional solution. Henry Ford's joke about solving his problem by paying his workers well cannot be in fact implemented. That's what I mean by saying there's no contractual solution to that problem. There's only an institutional solution. So this would be a tremendous jump in the American sensibility. But I think that's what's at stake. Now, I'm under no illusion. So if you say, well, I say, there's this vacuum, there should be a productivist alternative to it. Okay, I'll outline a productivist alternative to it. I don't think that's going to, in itself, change the way we think about this. Yes?
Yeah, going back to the concept of constituencies, I feel like the hardest faction to engage will kind of be...
Speak louder, please.
Yeah, the hardest faction to engage will be the first one. That is like...
The elites?
The elites, effectively. Because I feel like, obviously, for a lot of reasons we've kind of touched on in this class, I feel like America... Well, I won't say they're unique in this sense, but basically money has a big influence in basically which ideas are allowed to even come to the forefront to be discussed and taken seriously, let alone implemented. So I was thinking about the idea that you were talking about in how capital relates to the economy, and venture capital is a really small fraction of the overall financial system. But if you could basically sell it to the elites in a way where it's like, we're not trying to take things away from you, similar to like the Meiji Restoration, or how a lot of Western nations went from basically more agricultural systems or feudal systems to industrialized ones. A lot of the logic there wasn't just...
But just a minute there. On the question of the elites, what about the powerful element of nationalism and national interest? So the United States now is engaged in a rivalry with China and other countries. So what has happened repeatedly in the course of modern history is that a faction of the elites identifies its interests with the interests of national power. And it's on that basis that it then appeals beyond the elite to some part of the masses below. That's what's happened in all these movements of the so-called growth miracles. In every instance of those growth miracles, like the breakthroughs in Northeast Asia, in Taiwan, in Korea, and Japan, a faction of the elites says, we can't remain powerful and independent unless we come out of this backwardness. And so we have to look around in the world for what works best We have to sacrifice part of our traditional ways of doing things and recombine these imports from the rest of the world with some of what we'll retain. And we have to do this for the sake of national empowerment. That's how it works. So, and this is, of course, a feature of real politics with which Marxist theory has been particularly uncomfortable. But that's what's worked in the world, this association of elite with nation. And that's why I think it can be realistic. What do you say to that?
Oh, well, I think it's interesting because going back to thinking about social cohesion in America, I think it's easier in a country like, say, Japan, where it's like pretty homogenous, so it's easy for the elites to identify with like some unified concept of like national priorities. But I feel like, and also going back to the question we were talking about, the conservative settlement of the non-material concessions, it's like I think a lot of American elites haven't heard the so-called gospel of nationalism, to kind of use a different word. They're thinking about kind of what's in it for me, and if national empowerment is something that turns out to be in their self-interest, then you can.
Well, but it has surfaced in American history, right? So in the Kennedy period, the rivalry with the Soviet Union, and in the Trump period, then rivalry with China, and he was not embarrassed about alluding to nationalism. So it's hard to imagine how there can be a project of this kind which doesn't involve this nationalist element as part of its practical basis. You know? And now there's a very tangible incentive to it in the United States, which is this rivalry with China. So if it's not going to be war, it's going to be peaceful competition. And the object of peaceful competition is victory, and especially victory on the terrain of the knowledge economy. So the question of what would seem like a theoretical question, why is there not a knowledge economy in North Dakota, which is the simple sort of spatial regional version of this issue, then becomes significant because it relates, the country can't hope to win this competition if its vanguard is restricted to these islands on the coast, right? The spirit of the knowledge economy has to penetrate a large part of the society for there to be this ascent up to the frontier of productivity by a substantial part of the economic agents. That's then the basis of this program of national rejuvenation, as the Chinese would call it. Yes?
This is not necessarily about what we're talking about, but on a point that you mentioned earlier about crisis and that being the foundation of restructuring our economic system, in recent years, have we seen
A point I was making about what?
about crisis, so like war
Crisis.
or something? In recent years, have we seen like lack of responsiveness in times of crisis, or like a quicker reverting back to like the norm? I'm thinking about the pandemic and how it kind of feels like we're
No,
back
I don't think that these crises of the 21st century cannot be compared to those crises of the 20th century. So the truth is, despite all the vocabulary about climate disaster and pandemics, and these are modest crises compared to the crises of the 20th century. The Depression of the 1930s was a collapse, which there was a dramatic fall in national production, massive unemployment, and then the war, the Second World War, was the greatest war that had ever happened in the world. It was total war. So I don't think that's real crisis on a dimension which the 21st century hasn't seen. Yes?
What do you think? I don't know if you've heard of it, but Naomi Klein's idea of like the shock doctrine and sort of the idea that when these like economic or other crises come about, there is a change, but it's towards a more capitalistic and like harmful sort of use of the market rather than reforms and like.
Well, of course, the crisis doesn't provide its own answer. So, right, it's been this exogenous shock, which then opens the shell, lifts everyone out of the rut of their normal activities. That was the theme in War and Peace, right? The comet will come, Napoleon's invasion, and our lives will all be turned upside down. And then tremendous suffering, tremendous conflicts. And then in retrospect, everyone thinks that was the best moment in their lives, right? Because it's a liberation from routine. So there's this idea that, and then there's the romantic idea, which is we can't change the relation between spirit and structure. All we can do is have this interlude in which the rule of the structures is shaken. And in that interlude we'll be fully alive. But then the structures will reassert themselves. So it's a sense in which the romantic idea of the opposition between structure and spirit is a form of despair. What it despairs over is our ability not just to put one structure in place of another, but permanently to alter the relation between spirit and structure. That is, to create structures which invite their own revision and allow spirit to continue in structure. So, this is a deep undercurrent theme in our discussion, which is that what we come to when we discuss things in this mode, which I've exemplified today, is this idea that structural alternatives have primacy over non-structural alternatives. So if we just reallocate money from one use to another use, it's like the waves of the sea. It comes and goes. The only thing that's lasting in politics is the institutional legacy, because the institutions remain. They're the structure that remains as the waves of collective enthusiasm and lack of interest come and go. But the question is whether we continue to depend on this exogenous shock as the provocation for transformation. So, like the socialists and liberals of the 19th century, we have reason to affirm the primacy of structural change over non-structural change. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we also have reason to resist entrusting our collective futures to some dogmatic institutional blueprint. Because the liberals and socialists of the 19th century were all dogmatists. Each sect had its proposal. They said, here's the solution. It's the classical system of liberal rights. Or it's the socialist idea. Follow this and you'll become both rich and powerful. So our problem is that we have reason to resist this structural dogmatism, but also reason to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives. So then we have a concern that has no historical precedent, which is how can we affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism? That's our problem. And the practical implication is that in these institutions that we create, we should especially be concerned that they have the attribute of lending themselves to correction so that they not imprison us. So it not just be one more prison depending for our release from one more exogenous shock. And this is the experimentalist element, that our economic and our political institutions should invite their own revision, should help organize their own transformation. And the consequence for us, for each of us, is that it will be easier for us then to engage in them without surrendering to them. We will not have to choose between being insiders and outsiders. We will be able to be insiders and remain outsiders at the same time. So I think this can be seen as a characteristic of the American aspiration also. This is one of the reasons why I have hope that this experimentalist agenda could find a place in the United States. Well, I actually didn't come to the fourth part of my plan today, but so we'll continue next week, hopefully with the presence of John Stauffer.
The kids here. My lad and taught the middle schoolers.
Were they
I was doing no, the middle schoolers didn't scare me so much. There was an 11-year-old who did ask during process and he days of the opponent's like facts studies were. I was like, how do you know what meth are? Like the kid was like looking at stats on like right he's like, oh, this will increase that. He explained to me the methodologies on that study. And I was like, how do you know the methodology? I explained to another 11-year-old in this tournament, like 11 to 13. I was like, I explained to another one what conundrum is. Why do you know methodology? The high schoolers. I didn't teach them. That the